All right. Hello, everybody. My name's David Neustein. I'm a director of a Sydney practice called Other Architects. I'm delighted to be speaking to you today from the unceded lands of the Gadi people. I'd like to pay my deep respects to my Indigenous elders and like to say today that I strongly support the establishment of an independent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to government, and I hope that you do too. There is no land other than Aboriginal land, and there's no future other than an Aboriginal future. That's our future. So I prepared a little talk for you today called Space for Others. The purpose of this talk is to try to guide you in your development of a fantastic design project for the Super Studio Design Challenge. Other Architects is a practice that's very interested in the role of architecture in helping to manage change humanely, and in architecture's fundamental purpose, which is to show people what is possible, to show people, to provide guidance about how we can manage our spaces and how our spaces interact with our needs in daily life. The examples that I put together to you today, some of them are, there's a sort of, each one has two parts. There will be a universal design example of something we're very interested in, and then there'll be one of our projects which is related to that. And we've tried to choose projects which are more speculative designs or competition schemes so they're appropriate for the sort of design work that you'll be doing in response to the Super Studio Reorient program. So my talk today should be short and snappy. Before we go to a very interesting conversation, there are four parts: giving form to community, making space within space, inclusion and exclusion, and some questions. So part one, giving form to community. I'd like to open with this quote by philosopher Alfonso Lingus, who wrote a very interesting book, The Community of Those Who Have Nothing in Common, which I recommend, which is Lingus's attempt to define what a community is and why we have them, and how what they are as a social construct. And let me just read this quote to you. Community forms when one exposes oneself to the naked one, the destitute one, the outcast, the dying one. One enters into community not by affirming oneself and one's forces, but by exposing oneself to expenditure at a loss, to sacrifice. Community forms in a moment by which one exposes oneself to the other, to forces and powers outside oneself, to death and to the others who die. Very heavy quote on the surface, and I'm not just interested in this because it talks about others and we're other architects and we like all other related puns, but the gist of this little paragraph is to explain that community isn't formed by a bunch of people with roofs over their heads, stable incomes in the prime of their life, speaking the language of their country with full citizenship as a kind of great idea. It's not a club. It's not something that we do together to enjoy our company. It's not a social, it's not about socializing, if you like. Community is recognizing that there are people amongst us who need help and support, and that we need to give something of ourselves for them. So, people who are old or very young, people who don't speak the language, people who've arrived from elsewhere, people who don't have money, people who don't have work, people who might have physical impairments, people who might have other sorts of special needs. We create community to look after them, to provide for them, to make sure that they have their basic needs met. And in doing that, we also know that we're creating this kind of bond or knot that will provide for us when we're in the same situation. That's the purpose of community. So architecture has this fundamental role in communities by recognizing that it needs to support people's needs. And I think that's a fundamental part of the brief that you have for Super Studio. So one very small example that it's very dear to my heart, the architect Gunnar Asplund, co-designer of Woodland Cemetery, one of the great architectural masterpieces in Stockholm, that was designed and constructed over a period from 1915 to 1940 with his equally great co-architect Sigurd Leverance. This is an amazing landscape place with a whole bunch of incredible buildings, but there's one very small feature that I noticed on my first visit that I find very interesting in terms of architecture for community. You can see a little waiting area here in this image that I'm showing you. with a pool of water and some trees for shade and a protective wall. And in the corner of that image, on the left-hand side, you can see a bench by a window. This is a bench that is meant for people who might be waiting. They might be attending a funeral of a loved one, or they might be part of the funeral party, and they have a moment where they come out to this courtyard and they just need a break. They can look out the window and they can see the landscape outside. That's very consoling. But the interesting thing about this bench for me is that, as you can see, it's kinked shape. It has seats for two and then a third seat for one. It doesn't imply a particular use of the bench. There's no prescribed way of using it, but it suggests that someone else might come and join you. So if you were sitting on this bench alone and someone else could come and sit, they could sit at a slight angle to you, which is non-threatening. They're not lining up. They're not waiting for a bus next to you, but they're also not interviewing you from in front. They're just standing slightly they're just sitting slightly at an angle. And maybe they can just sit there without talking to you, or maybe they'll chat with you and give you some comfort. But it's a very interesting, subtle shape that suggests the type of interaction gently that you might need when you're at a vulnerable moment at something as significant as a funeral. We developed a project in 2019 called Burial Belt, was responding to some similar things and in the same area in cemeteries. Looking at, you can see in this image here that's from Rookwood Cemetery, how incredibly banal and suburban most Australian cemeteries are. So you're signing up if you go into a cemetery to be at one of these sort of parking plots, amongst others. At the same time, perversely, we're really running out of this type of space, and all over Australia, we don't have many of these parking plots left. So Burial Belt was both an attempt to try to find something that was much more satisfying and humane than this kind of car park arrangement, but also to find new spaces so that we could get out of the crisis of not having enough burial space between us. So we went looking on the edges of Sydney. In these drawings, you can see an area right in the south western boundary of the city where it meets the Nepean River at Camden. And we went looking for bits of available land on the edges of suburbia that were degraded farmland. And we thought about capturing all of those spaces and turning them into one big, joyful, commodious type of cemetery that could look after people without this kind of crush of need for space. And the idea was very much borrowing from Woodland Cemetery, was the idea of creating these sorts of forest burial spaces where we would carve small areas for people out of this very dense forest. Here's an image, a sort of suggested top view of one of those spaces. So the thought was that this forest burial could come and occupy this farmland region. It could protect against further suburban sprawl. It could provide, it could regenerate the native environment. And then within that, you could have these very nurturing burial spaces. And then larger clearings made within them, and then off them very small sort of sub-clearings, burial rings where individuals could come and be buried in the forest in a way that would create a greater dignity and a greater sense of individualism than what is currently being offered in most of the spaces that we provide for this purpose across Australia. And if you'd like to know more about any of these sorts of projects, you can always go to our website where we explain a bit more detail. But the gist of it basically is this idea of making new space and of thinking about what people's needs are and of trying to give them dignity in those moments. That project that we initiated for a architecture triennale in Oslo continues to live in our practice, as the proposal that you might prepare for studio might do for you. Whenever you come up with some new idea, it has a lot of agency in terms of your own thinking. It's a lot more valuable than working to a prescribed brief. In this case, there's a little town called Bendock, which is on the Victorian side of the New South Wales-Victoria border in the Monaro region. And we've been working with an organisation called Earth Funerals to make the first of a whole series of natural burial grounds. And you can see that in that map in the top left corner of this slide, that a lot of the thinking about making and occupying clearings from burial belt has been applied in the real world. And here in this forest setting, we've currently created and have had installed a series of little markers that just allow you to move around in that burial space and to know where the graves are and to be able to position yourself. And we're gradually adding more layers like walls and a gate to open that burial space for public use. Now, the next topic of this little lecture, making space within space, I'm going to read to you two quotes now from two non-consecutive directors of the Venice Biennale who have been asking themselves, I guess, what architecture is supposed to do in this day and age. The first one from Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara of Grafton Architects from Free Space in 2018. A beautiful wall forming a street edge gives pleasure to the passerby, even if they never go inside. So too does a glimpse into a courtyard through an archway or a place to lean against in the shade or a recess which offers protection from the wind and rain. So Yvonne and Shelley are talking about how architecture can give a additional benefit or can help to look after a larger group of people than those that it's primarily made for. So in the making of the way that it allows for views, it allows for places for the body, it allows for some measure of protection from the elements. Those things can be, add up to a very generous and comfortable urban environment if they participate with other parts of the city. Other than, if you just think about the needs of the occupants of a building, you might miss this opportunity to sort of to provide for other people, and the imagination of who else might benefit from it is a key part of really great architecture. The next quote is from Leslie Loco, who is the curator of the current Venice Biennale, the Laboratory of the Future. Shade is not regulated, it is accidental, civic-minded, usually free. No one remembers who planted the trees or indeed to whom they might belong. Shelter from the sun is a public resource, one of the truly democratic spaces that are left. I think that's a very interesting and timely quote at the moment that most of the world is going through we're all going through the hottest year in the world in planetary history, or at least in recorded planetary history. Shade is now a very critical part of the way that we make our cities, but it's a place that people come together, and it's a place where community can form, because some people might have the option of going inside to the air conditioning, other people don't, and they seek out this public shade as a way of getting respite from the elements. And often when you go under a tree or an awning, you might not have permission to be there, but you're just borrowing that space to get out of the sun. I think in both of these instances, they tell us a lot about what architecture can what it can do at its most basic, on its most basic terms, to think about its purpose and how it relates to the world around it. And there's an urgency there as well. So this is a project I've often been fascinated by, but actually didn't know as much as I needed to about this until Lisa and Andrej invited me to give this short talk. So I've enjoyed learning about it. It's a project called Passage 56. It's on the east side of Paris, actually very near Père Lachaise Cemetery. It was initiated in 2005. It's ongoing. Basically, in this little aerial view, you can see a little narrow kind of laneway alongside this building that turns around as a kind of U with one leg longer than the other. That little the sort of dog leg of the building there was a new volume that was created in the 2000s, and it left this kind of space next to it. Because that new building had windows into that passageway, the passageway couldn't be used for some other type of infill development. It was just sitting there. And it was too small at 200 square meters to really be viable for some other type of development away from the windows. So it became a kind of no person's land. It was disused. And a Paris authority called the Delegation for City Policy and Integration reached out to an architecture practice, Atelier d'Architecture Autogérée, which means self-directed architecture workshop. It's run by Doina Petrescu and Constantine Petcal. And they invited them to propose a use for this space. Interestingly, Atelier d'Architecture Autogéré, AAA, didn't take over this project as an architect, but they actually established a NGO, a non-government organisation, and they reached out to a whole lot of members of the local community and community groups and said, what do we want to do here? And they created a kind of larger stakeholder group. So right from the beginning, instead of dealing with this as like, oh, here's a cool opportunity for architecture, they went, what can we do here? Who might need this? Who is this for? And how can we kind of rally them together? And they took on an extraordinary level of ownership of this project at the same time. And I'm not actually clear what the financial situation was that enabled this, but it was obviously incredibly entrepreneurial and inventive. What they did was they basically decided this would be a kind of experimental space for the community's use. And they partnered with an eco-construction firm who brought together a whole lot of interns in eco-construction, and they built this structure you can see in this, this diagrammatic axo at the front of the site as a kind of staging place. And then in behind that, they created a garden. And the purpose of this garden was to create a circular economy of growing, waste, water, but really as a place for the community to come together. I've had a bit of a glitch here. One moment. There we go. What I find really interesting about this project and what I think is really relevant is if this unused plot had just been set up as a market garden for the community's use, it may not have been particularly successful because it would have retained its appearance as a kind of disused water site. And if you were working in there or having events in there, you would just be exposed to the street and it might not be a comfortable place. It wouldn't have an address to the surrounding area. By building this little structure, self-building this little structure that has solar power and water collection and can be used as a projector for film screenings and things like that, they gave the site an address and they sort of bracketed and framed what would happen in behind. So this very small little building you can see on the street fills in the street, creates a kind of welcoming presence on the street. If you like, fills in the kind of empty spot where there used to be a tooth, and then is a staging point that allowed for the activities that happened in Passage 56 to take place. Interestingly, the architecture practice managed this space themselves, which is again another kind of incredible level of investment in a project, until 2009 when they were able to hand it over to a newly formed group that now manages the use of the space. And if you go on Google Maps today, you'll see that it's still very much in use within that part of Paris. We had some similar interests with a project of ours called Offset House that Grace and I originally developed in 2015 for the Chicago Architecture Biennial. This is an image by my brother-in-law from a place they were staying in Casula in Western Sydney, looking out over the backyards from where he was towards the neighbours. And you can see how these 1.8 metre high colour bond fences just close everybody off from each other. They're a border that almost prevents any type of interaction from happening. And when you look at that on the neighbourhood scale, you see this whole series of little cells, all divided by their fences, all cut off and remote from each other, where people have to have all of this, everyone has to have their own toaster. Everybody has to look after their kids individually. There's no space of kind of agreement or exchange between these houses. And this is, of course, in strong contrast to some of the modes of living that are very strong culturally in Australia. For example, our Indigenous communities had larger family groups than this kind of nuclear family of parents and kids. And they set up the way that they would sleep and live together so that a larger, more expansive community of immediate family, kin, and strangers could all come together and relate socially. And they knew their place within that community, and they could therefore they could manage sort of conflicts and interactions between each other in a very sophisticated way. Similarly, Australia is a incredibly multicultural society with people from all different parts of the world, and many of those other cultures that have come to and now live in Australia come from traditional modes of living where there were much more expansive and interactive notions of the household than that kind of suburban nuclear family model. This is a traditional Malay house, and you can see how there are, this is definitely not one family. This is all kinds of, these are people from the neighborhood, all of whom feel very comfortable being in this traditional house, coming together. There are spaces that are shared where sleeping or praying or meeting or playing could all happen in the same area, and it's managed much more in time than in space. So there's a way of handling the needs that's deployed across the same structure, but over time, rather than by creating a network of individual rooms. We in Offset House, we were very interested in that sort of trying to create that possibility, and in trying to look at the structure of the suburbs in a way that allowed for this type of communal use. And the sort of primary idea about that was just saying these houses are bigger than they need to be. We proposed making smaller volumes within the frame of the large suburban house. The area that between the new volume within and the outer frame could be occupied as a kind of interstitial zone of veranda that would establish a line of privacy. And then at the scale of the neighborhood, what that meant was you didn't need the fences anymore for privacy. You could pull down your fences and you could consolidate the space in between the houses for collective use. So in these views of models, you can see the sort of typical situation that I showed in that first photo, where everyone is divided by their 1.8 meter high fences. And then once those fences come down, once the fences come down, you establish this kind of shared terrain where lots of more things are possible, and where the parents and children and grandparents of these families might be able to participate in shared activities. So the kids could play together, adults could meet, grandparents could spend time doing things together. And in a way, you can see how there's a kind of latent space that was always there, just like the space of Passage 56, that just needed a kind of intervention potentially to make it available for that type of use. So maybe you'll see latent spaces like that when you're thinking about how to respond to this exercise. The last of the three sort of themes before we get to a couple of questions is inclusion and exclusion. This is a quote from a poem that I love, which is sort of universally known called Mending Wall by Robert Frost. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out. And that's something that I think as architects, that sort of question is always very useful for us to ask, because we think we're following a sort of objective, but we don't always ask ourselves what the byproducts or unintended consequences of that objective will be. If you're lucky enough to go down to Neilson Park in Sydney over summer, you may or may not find the bathing pavilion, which is kind of hidden within the trees and back from the beach, which you can see here in this aerial image, which was built by the New South Wales government architect, actually, or designed by the New South Wales government architect and built in 1932. If you look at this photo, on the left-hand side is where you enter. You come in through a sort of central pavilion, which used to be ticketed, and then there were male off to the lower part of the image, if you like, and female up to the upper part of the image, sides that you were diverted into before you reach the beach via a tunnel, which is now open again through the boardwalk, which would mean that you could pass through without the kind of embarrassment of having to interact with other people when you change into your bathers. Here you can see images of what the building looks like today. It's sheltered by this wall that kind of cuts out any view to the surrounding area. And then here's that where you would enter through that discrete little archway, and then you choose which side to go to. But what I find particularly interesting and beautiful about this space is the way that it frames the meeting of strangers as a kind of space of encounter that you wouldn't ordinarily have. So rather than kind of getting changed in your own little cubicle or something like that, you have these comfortable niches around the outside of the wall, and you have a very, very large amount of space in the middle with a very undefined purpose. And that's large enough that you don't have to feel awkward sort of bumping and moving past somebody else, but it's also big enough that you can then mingle or come across other people. You've got this possibility of neighborliness and encounter, which as we come out of COVID, as we are more and more immersed in our social media, as we are more and more divided by our work and by all the pressures of contemporary life, we crave these sorts of interactions and encounters with others. And we need spaces like this that allow us, that give us a subtle prompt again towards recognizing other people and feeling a sense of communality. And what I particularly love about this changing room structure is just how the showers and the benches for changing, how the toilets, they cluster into the walls. Everything is pushed right out to the perimeter, and the most amount of space possible is made inside for just movement and for unplanned kind of connection between people. We had very kind of similar interests, I'd say, when we worked with Ritalik Thompson, who are another Sydney practice, on a proposal for the NGV Architecture Commission in 2017, which we were fortunate enough to win. And what we were thinking about were these kind of fundamental properties of walls, and whether what we could do to take the NGV garden, which is often a very sort of open and unplanned space that people run out to with their kids but don't necessarily know what to do there, and it's very remote from the main space of the gallery, whether there was a way to kind of frame and give a chance for people to occupy it in a more engaged way, whether the properties of the wall could sort of shelter spaces, distinct spaces, and allow people more license to use them and to meet others. And these were some tests that we did with Daria Nosova, who was a member of our practice at the time, taking works from the NGV's collection and thinking about how a wall could enter into these garden scenes and suggest the way that a space could be occupied, or change the way you might think about how that space is framed. The proposal was this meandering sort of labyrinth made of a double wall that would, as it worked away on like the kind of old game of Nokia Snake, would provide these sort of little pockets and spaces with different dimensions that would work around the existing features of the garden, whether they were sculpture or landscape, and frame rooms. And in these film stills from a film that Coco and Maximilian did, you can see how these sort of rooms are framed. So if you think about this space being very open, a very open terrain previously, the wall creates little pockets. It creates moments for people to sit and contemplate. It creates moments of sort of glimpsed views of intimacy. You get a much more heightened sense of people passing by. You can see there's a lady with a pram sort of partially visible in the background of this image. So you get a much greater sense of sharing the space with others. And then you get these sorts of rooms that invite you to spend more time rather than just sort of passing through. So again, you can see how in the last couple of examples, how walls can be very problematic in the way that they close off and exclude others, and they can also be incredibly useful and powerful in the way that they create spaces around our bodies that allow us to occupy them and give us some sense of safety or protection or intimacy or calm. And it was very interesting as an experiment with this project to have that as a theory, that the walls would do that, and then to be able to watch this. This was a moment that was captured by photographer Peter Bennett that we weren't there for, of a group of parents and young children occupying that central space in the garden in a way where they felt completely at ease and comfortable. And it was a very interesting kind of validation of that theory, that this would be possible. This was a type of activity that just wasn't happening in that garden prior to that temporary structure being put in place. So lastly, before we go to our conversation, some questions that were prompted by reading the brief that you've received. How do you generate a project with this quite open but very relevant brief? How do you put something together that's specific? And the questions are where. So what site lends itself to intervention? What can you see around you in your everyday environment that just looks like a space that is unframed or open or harsh or exposed in some way, where you can just intuitively imagine something appearing in that space that would help to give it definition or help to make a kind of place out of a non-place. Who's around that space who might need this intervention? Is it a space that is a barrier to people who have limited mobility? Is it a space that's in an area where there are limited community facilities? Is it a space where people who might be working during the day might choose to spend some time? So who can you imagine might benefit from the making of a space? With what means? So what are the sort of fundamental properties of architecture that you can draw on to inhabit or make that space tangible? Is it exposed to the sun? Does it need shelter? Is it exposed to traffic? Does it need some level of enclosure? How do you enable rest? How do you enable access? How do you give it a sense of kind of calm? How do you frame or compose the environment around it? And the last of those questions is in what manner? It's when you have an idea, you'll formulate an idea, but the way of actually communicating that idea to your Super Studio judges, but also to people more broadly, will be fundamental to how they understand its efficacy. In all the examples we've shown, you've seen how the language and the sorts of images and drawings we produced have been very important to how we can describe those sorts of ideas. So as you're thinking about where, who, and what of your design project, you also need to think about the manner in which you're going to communicate it so that others can understand its purpose. And for example, if you're thinking about this project reorienting to a particular use, it might be very important to show what was there before and what's happened afterwards. And it might also be very important to show the way in which, suggest the way in which it's being used and to suggest who it's being used by. All of those sorts of aspects will be quite important, I think, to other people being able to understand what you've responded to and how successful you've been in that response. So those are the questions. I hope you've enjoyed that little talk. As you can see, I'm joined here by Grace, my co-director, and let's jump into a conversation.
Great, thanks, David and Grace. Such a wonderful selection of both your own projects and projects around the world, just to flesh out this brief. I think we couldn't have introduced it better ourselves.
Thank you.
Really, it's great. It was, just to touch on what you started on in terms of talking about vulnerability. I thought that was such a true observation. Like when we think about migrant communities or the flood affected communities, these really it's these really vulnerable communities that have the strongest social bonds. And it kind of made me wonder in terms of our brief and that last question on the slide of who needs this intervention. In a way, does that kind of suggest that maybe it's those who are the most comfortable with, as you said, roofs over their heads and living comfortable lives, who have forgotten about the power of human connection? Are they some of the people that this brief is potentially should be addressed towards? Do we need to sort of use spatial cues and prompts to kind of remind those people that community is important? Or it was just an interesting thought that came into my mind. Not sure what you guys think.
I think it's such an interesting question, because the reality is that community, like active community, really benefits everybody. So even if you are in this current moment relatively autonomous and not needing other people materially, the act of helping others and sharing with others and giving more than yourself, and also forming these kinds of bonds with people, those things are incredibly fulfilling and important in everyday life. So if you are you might be a fly in, fly out mining worker who has a big ute and a big house and a big income, and any of your material needs might be met at any one moment, but you might be deeply missing what the experience that would happen if you were volunteering at a school or something, and you could meet other parents or meet children or meet teachers and kind of get to know other people and feel a sense of a kind of life outside of your own walls. So I think that you know, and I think we were in our sort of lead up conversation, we were pondering this as well. I think what the motivation is for initiating a project, what the motivation is, like, who are you acting for? And I think it can come from recognizing who might, you know, like who might be vulnerable or who might be displaced or who might need the most help, but can also come selfishly from a kind of drive, seeing what's lacking, seeing what's not there around you and thinking, oh, this is what I want in my environment. And I don't think the two things are incompatible. You want to add anything?
No, I agree.
Yeah, so it sounds like in some ways the who or where, you could really tackle the project from either angle first. You could start with an observation of people, or you could start with an observation of place as well, potentially.
Totally. And I just want to say, like, we're big believers in very simple ideas. We often come out with very obvious and very unsophisticated thoughts, and our technique is to kind of worm our way into something more useful. So we just throw something out there, and there's this kind of safe space through collaborating, which I hope that the Super Studio participants will give themselves the luxury of having, where we come up with something very crude and maybe very naive, and then we just sort of talk about what it's doing or what it could do until we've got our sort of teeth into something a bit more sophisticated or a bit more multi-purpose. So, and that's kind of where those speculative projects come from.
Yeah, that's definitely where they begin. And it's sort of like the cliche of like no bad idea to start with, like just sort of trying to start somewhere and then having conversations in the studio between the office and sort of working things up and making it into a more wholesome picture of an idea.
Yeah. Is that how you guys work? How do you work?
That's a good question. It was interesting when you mentioned like sort of that selfish motivation for a design, because I think we started our practice doing a housing competition, but a lot of that was motivated by our own feelings about the lack of a product out there that we wanted to live in. So I mean, that's definitely one kind of common thread in the way we approach design. And I guess, yeah, I think simple forms and simple gestures are the most powerful as well. Sometimes it's quite hard to create something simple. It's more often that they end up getting overly complex. So I think it's incredibly powerful to see such a simple project like your walled intervention in the NGV, and it's a real a lesson for students to kind of think about the simple gestures.
Yeah, it was really nice in your talk, guys, how I sort of wrote down three approaches to that community building in the cemetery, forming space through regeneration as a space for community, and then the reframing or the offset house, removing a barrier to community, and in the walls, sort of this framing encounters with strangers. Like, they are all very in some ways crude and simple ideas, but that's in some ways the power and the beauty of them, the fact that they are, through those crude ideas, so also emerging from an observation of a space. I think they're perfect inspiration for what we'd like to encourage from the students in this competition as well.
I think that's really nice. Thank you. And I think that, a lot of we did competitions and things like that when we were at uni. And like this thinking, I think that for all of the students who take part, it's not even, I don't think they should focus on having the best answer or on winning Super Studio. I think that I would encourage everyone to take part just as a chance to explore some of these thoughts and just build up your thinking. Because, I'm 41 years old and I still think I'm at the beginning of my thinking. I'm incredibly basic and I'm still learning about like how wide a window might be in a certain situation. I'm amazed, like, oh, maybe that window, that discussion of sort of how things come together or how big they should be for me is still ongoing. And these are opportunities like this are really great chances to kind of just bracket your thinking, apply it, and see what you get to as an exercise.
Well, yeah, and like a way when we approach competitions, it's always, and I'm sure you guys are the same, it's what can you get out of it, not are you going to win, because that's probably pretty unlikely. We're very good at coming second. That's our speciality. So it's really like, what are you getting out of it? And I think that comes back to what David was saying about in what manner. So that is always very important for us.
But also we started winning competitions and we started getting selected for biennials and things once we started doing things entirely for what we could get out of it.
Yeah.
We actually were much less successful in competitions before that because we always tried to sort of do what we thought would win.
Yeah.
And when we let go of that and just started doing what interested us and tried to be like what we could do confidently, like it was all about like what would we understand in our own basic terms, and what could we say confidently this makes sense or this works, rather than like what do we think people want to see. That's when we kind of unlocked our power. So I think that's a good thing for students as well. If you've only learned about timber stud construction at this stage, and you only really understand a few things like how tall a bench should be, or like how tall you are in relationship to a fence, use those things. Don't try to prove that you know all these things that you don't know, but just use what's in your own power. I think that's always the most effective.
Definitely.
No, that's true. It's a good reminder.
What, like in terms of your future homes design, what I think is really interesting looking at that is there are some elements and units like the depth of a kitchen bench that are kind of a given. It has to be no less than 60 centimeters. And if it was more than 70 centimeters, it would be like inappropriately luxurious. So you're kind of working with things like that are fixed modules, or how wide a door has to be to let people in, or how wide a corridor has to be to enable some level of access, like universal access. And then there's the other bits around the margins that you pushed or pulled or found two things that can be the same space, like an access way working as a kind of balcony. And that kind of push and pull is the kind of what becomes really interesting for me about in architecture, the kind of the thing about the givens and the free for all. So, like I think that will also be very interesting probably in these proposals as well. There'll be certain things that are kind of fixed and other things that are free to experiment with. And if you're looking for I guess the context around all of this discussion as well is that we now operate in an incredibly, there's almost no public service in Australia. There's very limited public and community funding. Public schools are being turned into a sort of distressed asset, and private schools are being funded better than public schools. There's a kind of neoliberal mentality in Australia where people are meant to pay for what they have. And what that's meant is there's less and less stuff that's being done that's just done for sort of public benefit without some kind of intended financial dividend at the end of that process. So there's this sort of like insidious ideas like value recapture, where the government will only build a stadium or a swimming pool or something if they can point to an uplift in the value of developer land around that, and they can prove that they'll be able to balance their budget. And they're also at pains to kind of shunt that project off to commercial interest to sort of build it and manage it so they don't have to take on that risk. In saying all of that, what that means is we have this landscape around us where there's just an increasingly limited amount of stuff that gets made just so people can kind of sit or have a meal or wait or just have some time out of their everyday use. Those spaces are increasingly enclosed as food halls or as sort of public-private community centres where there's a lot of sort of technology that's being invested in them, and there's a lot less sort of unplanned space or experimental space, which is just meant to kind of bolster what people do. One of the things that we find very inspiring that you can visit if you're in Sydney or in Melbourne is the work of Mike Hewson, who's an artist and landscape designer, a super interesting guy who's been making playground spaces that are kind of weird throwbacks to when playgrounds were experimental and not just full of plastic products from large suppliers sort of arrayed to make a kind of network of games for kids that have a very limited use. These are kind of vague amorphous spaces, but they also speak to a much bigger group of people than just the kids who are sort of parked there by their handlers for an hour or two to let off steam. They open up all of these other possibilities for who might use them. I don't know if they're explicitly community spaces, but they suggest a bigger idea of community, and they suggest that there should be a lot more openness and experimentation in the environment around us. So that very long-winded statement is basically, I'm confident that if anyone goes outside right now, they will see there's a lack of open spaces that are open to the possibility of people who don't know each other or might have tenuous links gathering and spending time there. And I think there's a lot of potential to start to think about that. And what a great collective group of projects that's thinking about a larger communal need and not just what things can make money or which developer might agree that that thing stacks up on paper. We don't think that everything should be paid for. The benefits should be pushed on longer term, longer generation. We don't need to pay for everything up front with some kind of business case.
I thought as well that in some ways my mind is pushed back to the quote you started with Yvonne and Shelley talking about free space and how a building or the edge of a building might think about people beyond the brief of that space. And in some ways that's what drew us a bit to the Future Homes competition and the idea of how you might rethink suburban infill is not so much just the building and what that means, but actually how the suburb could transform, or how you could do a sort of reverse value capture of, like, instead of building an infrastructure and having an uplift, the development, how could the development uplift the area through public realm and whatnot.
Totally. There's so much in there.
Yeah. With
sorry, Andrej.
No, that also just pushes, is something that I think is so great about the Offset House as well, that project, in that it's thinking about the space around the building as the drive for how you design the building as well.
Well, I think there's a great shared sensibility with those proposals because they both care about what's there, and they are genuinely committed to recognizing the value of what already exists and what qualities are already desirable in the sort of, middle ring suburbs of our cities. And architects are always worried about whether they get to do the kind of next incredible art gallery or something. And they're quite dismissive of sort of banal everyday spaces because they think that they're not beautiful. But that's not really, we don't see that the job of architects to just make beauty. We think that our value is in caring for what's already there, increasingly because we're running out. We're running out of what's there. We are turning the organic world around us into hard material, and so there's just less and less of what we have around us. And so our job, I think, increasingly is just to be advocates for keeping what we can. And we need proposals for places like low-rise suburbs that look like, from an eagle-eyed property developer, might just look like a spreadsheet where you could stack extra height and volume and sell it off. But there's all kinds of things happening in and on the ground that are really beneficial to our lives, and we need other visions for what we can do to care for those sorts of spaces.
Definitely. That might be a good moment to close on.
Yeah.
I always enjoy talking to both of you. I think it's fantastic that you're guiding Super Studio this year. You're a brilliant example for students of young professionals who have gone from being excellent architects, working for others and through their education, into having a really inspiring practice. And they can see in you that it's possible to aspire to do more than just work on the kind of standard commercial stuff. And how excellent.
Thanks, guys. Very much.
Back at you.
Really appreciative of your time and generosity, sharing your ideas, and helping guide this conversation, really.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
It's been insightful for us, really.
We've
Thanks so
enjoyed
much.
the topic. Great brief.
Yeah,
Thank you.
definitely.
All right.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, Grace and David.
Thanks again. Yeah.
See ya.